I am doing something different today. Instead of calling roll, I'm going to, I found out that I can save the chat box. So from now on, when you get in and I start the class, I want you to type your name in the chat box and say here, and that way I know I can save that, and that's my record that you were here. So if you come in late, make sure that you type in that you're here. Right now, go ahead and type in your name and type that you're here. And of course I can, yeah, Ava and Jacob, good. Morgan there, that's exactly what I want, your actual name plus, because sometimes you may have signed in with another name other than that. But I got you guys. Your guys are good. You guys are looking good. I'm great. That's great. Terrific. That's the way I'm going to do the roll from now on. So just make sure that you do that, and then at the end of class, I'll save it, and that way I'll keep it as a record that you guys were here during class. Of course, you have to stay during class. You can't just say you're here and then disappear. That's not right. You have to be here. But even if you did that, it will catch up with you, and if you're not listening to the lectures, you probably won't do well on the quizzes and tests because you are students who wanted face-to-face classes, which means you like to hear the person talking, and most of the time you like to see them, their facial expressions, their body expressions. Of course, you can't see my body expressions, but you hear my tone, you see my facial expressions, and that helps individuals. Some individuals learn that way. So most students who want face-to-face classes, that's the thing, that's why they want face-to-face classes. That's the way they learn. Online isn't for everybody. Okay, so what we're looking at in the what I've shared for you is the class front menu system, and you can see that there are now two big brown dots because those big brown areas are the ones we've already gone through, and the yellow area is biopsychology. That's what we're working on right now. But also remember that development is online right now, and you can actually work ahead if you want to in the development section. So it's okay. I will always have one section opened ahead of where we're working so that you guys can work ahead if you need to or want to. This is where we are right now, and remember I have the links up here now for the Zoom class, so if you forget the link, all you have to do is log into the class and click the link. And also my office hours, I'm online with Zoom every day from 10 to 12 to answer any questions. I have my phone with me, and I've logged in with my phone so that if I don't have to be stuck sitting here at the table waiting for somebody to call in, I can be outside or wandering around in the house, and as soon as I hear the ding that somebody has logged in, then I can connect with that person. So let me change the share back to our PowerPoint presentation, and this is where we ended last time. I left it on a cliffhanger so that you would want to come back and listen. So most people, we're talking about chromosomes, most people have 23 pairs of chromosomes, but some people have less, and some people have more. And we found out with Down syndrome, trisomy 21, that more is not always better. And in fact, I've never heard of a situation where more chromosomes turns out to be better than the normal amount of chromosomes. And of course, less chromosomes turns out to be somewhat of a problem as well. But the really interesting ones are the sex chromosomes, X and Y. So if you have two X's, you're a female, and if you have an X and a Y, you're a male. In most cases, I will say most cases, because not all cases are the same. Some people have more or less than they should have. Turner syndrome is having one X chromosome and no Y chromosome and no second X chromosome, just one X. And it's okay. There's minor problems with that, but you're a female because you have X. It's not as bad as having one X that's broken, then you're in trouble. And it's definitely better than having just a Y because there's no such thing as a Y. If a zygote ends up with just a Y and no X, that zygote, even if it implants, never makes it to term and spontaneously aborts in a very short, it's a miscarriage, almost immediately after implantation. And the reason is the X chromosome is required to start the process of development. We're all females to begin with because only the X is working. And then the Y comes online and we all turn into males, but sometimes the Y comes online and it doesn't work properly because there's a problem in one of the genes, and you end up with a person who's XY and female, completely female. But as I said, they're usually sterile. So Turner syndrome is okay with just one X, but just one Y does not work. Super males have an extra Y, so they are XYY. They actually have more testosterone being generated in their system, and they're shorter most of the time. They're shorter, beefier, much more muscular, and they have a slightly lower, not huge, but a slightly lower mental state, and they cannot control their emotions well. Now, boys cannot control their emotions well anyway, and anyone who has children with a boy and a girl knows the boys are harder to deal with because they can't control their emotions as well. Girls are better at controlling their emotions, and school systems know this too. The boys tend to get in trouble way more than the girls do because they are not controlling their emotions well. Well, if you're an XYY, you cannot control your emotions well. And I use Mike Tyson as an example, although I don't know that Mike Tyson is XYY because he's taller, not short, but he's definitely beefier, and he bit the ear of one of his opponents. Now, I was a boxer in college in Golden Gloves, and you don't bite your opponent. So he can't control his emotions very well. And that's a perfect example of a person who was XYY. So these people who are XYY end up having problems with the law many times because they are an emotional person, even in their adult years, very emotional. They can't control the emotion. Their emotions overwhelm their reasoning, and they're very strong, very beefy people who don't think as clearly as a normal person, and so they get in trouble often because of their power and their emotion problems. And so you find them in prison systems at a higher percentage than should be in the prison system. If it was a typical how much you have in the system in the normal population, the percentage should mirror what you have in the prison system, but it doesn't. They're way higher in the prison system than they are in the normal population. My question would be then, if we know this happens, then, and we do take genetics for children. There's a blood test taken for children when they're born in the hospital to make sure that they don't have certain diseases. And that blood test can tell us if they're XYY. And if they're XYY, should we just build a little baby prison and put all the XYY babies in the prison right away just because, we know that the majority of them are going to end up in prison anyway? Should we? I don't see any yeses or nos. Nobody has an opinion on it? Oh, there's no's. Okay. I don't think so. Yeah. No, that's correct. No, we shouldn't, because there are people in the normal population who have XYY that don't end up in jail. So it's not the fact that they're XYY that puts them in jail. It's the fact they can't control their emotions and they have such power. Well, then if we know that a child is XYY, we need to work with that child more, give them more help in developing and controlling their emotions, and they will be able to. And there's plenty of people who are XYY who are boxers, because it's they got the muscle for it, and who also can do all kinds of vocational stuff that requires muscles. A person who is a fireman, who wants to be a fireman, they could pick up 2 people, put them on their shoulders, and carry them out of a building easily as an XYY. So if there's plenty of places, plenty of jobs for people who are XYY. And if they learn to control their emotions, then there's plenty out there for them to do. So that's what we would need to do, is just work with them, as we should do with all males anyway, because they can't control their emotions well, and they should learn what it means. And of course they end up, lots of males, very few females, lots of males end up in anger management trainings because they just don't know how to control their emotions, and they've never been taught. So Fragile X syndrome contains a damaged X. If you're a female, you already have one good X and then one bad X, damaged X, and it really doesn't do that much damage to a female. But for a male, they need the X for it to start the process of development, and they need the X genes in there all during the process of development. And Y comes along later and starts up and does a few other things, but the X is fundamentally necessary in development. So for a male, having Fragile X is way worse than for a female who already has one good X, even if they have one bad X. Klinefelter syndrome is an interesting one because they're XY, but they have 2 X's. So they're male, XY, but they have 2 X's, making it more feminine, having more of the characteristics of a female. And you can look up these links, take you to the places online that actually talk about them. And one of the reasons, and we'll talk about this in development, one of the reasons I bring this up is because people say that you become a homosexual simply because you decided to. It's a choice. And no, in many cases, it's not simply a choice. This is the way the person's genetics are. This is the way that person is. That's just part and parcel to the human condition. It's a spectrum. Being male and female is a spectrum. Some people are very, very male. Some people are very, very female. But then there's also everybody that's in between that as well. So here is the question then for this particular portion. We're looking at genetics, which is nature, what our genes are. So is nature more important, or is nurture more important in these conditions? Certainly in XYY, the nature says that this person is going to be a problem person because of their power, lowered intelligence, and high emotions. But nurturing helps that person to survive in the world and get along with everybody else. And there's not a problem then for the person who is XYY, who's trained really well. So that's nature is XYY, and training is the nurturing portion. So the nurturing is really important for the XYY person. But they wouldn't be XYY if they, they wouldn't have a problem in the first place if they weren't XYY, if they were just XY. So which is more important? And it's a strange argument in psychology. Why worry about which is more important? Just take care of the issue. Whatever the issue is, let's make sure that they get the nurturing they need. And for those people who nurturing doesn't help at all, well then let's make sure that the world is set up well for that person, whatever it is that they have a problem with. So that's the problems with chromosomes, and we'll look at some more problems with chromosomes later on. So how do we actually tell if a person's issues are genetic or if they are nurturing, environmental? And in twin studies, we can see this very well. When the sperm and the egg get together, there is a cell that is formed called the zygote. So it's one single cell. It now has all of, well, hopefully it has all of the chromosomes it needs to implant and grow into a human being, the zygote, one cell. That one cell sometimes grows a little bit. Maybe it splits and becomes 2 cells. Then it splits and becomes 4 cells. then it splits and becomes 8 cells. And at 8 cells, sometimes they will curl out of each other and become 2 4-celled organisms. And both of those 4 cells are identical to each other. Both of them implant and both of them grow, and that is an identical twin. That's what identical twins is. From one cell. It's mono, one, zygote, monozygote, because that cell is a zygote, called a zygote. Dizygotic twins is 2 eggs that have been released, and both of the eggs become zygotes, and both of the eggs implant, and both of the eggs grow into non-identical twins, dizygotic twins, 2 zygotes, and they have about 50% identical DNA. Now, there's a caveat with that. So they are 50% identical DNA if they have the same father. If the sperm came from the same person, and so you can have dizygotic twins that are the same mother, obviously, because the eggs came down, but different fathers. It is possible and does happen. They're about 25% the same DNA then. But we don't purposely separate the children, but in many cases, children are given up for adoption, and the adoption agencies do not attempt to keep them together, to adopt them together. If a family comes in and wants one of the twins, then they'll take that twin and the other twin will get adopted by somebody else. Those twins later in life might find each other, and there will be differences between them and similarities between them. So let me take an example of that. So we have, let's say, a Caucasian family, Jewish family, a Caucasian Jewish family. They give up their identical twins for adoption. One twin is adopted by a Buddhist family, Asian Buddhist family. The other one is adopted by an African-American Muslim family. Okay? Will their skin color change because of their relationship, that they were adopted by somebody with different skin color? No. Good. I'm glad you all said no. Will their hair color change? Will their eye color change? And the answer is, again, no, it will not. That's a genetic trait that will not change. It doesn't matter what their environment is. Those particular genes do not change by environment. But let's look at their religion. They were a Jewish family that gave them up into a Buddhist and a Muslim family. Will their religions be different? Most probably they'll be growing up with their parents' religion and not their sire's religion, but the parents' religion, the people who are giving them all of the loving that they need and the education and the nurturing that they need and putting up with the pains of having a child. Right? So their religion will probably be different. How about their weight and height? Could that be different? Waiting for an answer on that. Yes, I see some yeses. And the reason why it could be different is because of what they're eating as they're growing up. Buddhists are vegetarian. So they're getting vegetarian food on one side. On the other side, Muslims, they eat meat. Not pork, but they'll eat other meats. So they're getting a very different diet between the two. And you might find that that changes their height and changes their weight as well. There's also problems in the brain that can be associated with different things that happen to them in their environment, where they're growing up, the different chemicals that they're exposed to in the different areas that they grow up in. So there are lots of differences that can come from their environment, and the genes won't change. The genes won't change. So things that are directly correlated with the genes that have very little to do with environmental changes, they're not going to change at all. And there is a city in Ohio called Twinsburg, Ohio. And in Twinsburg, Ohio, every year, they have a party for twins. They invite everybody in the world who's a twin is invited to this party. It's an open invitation to every twin in the world, dizygotic or monozygotic, doesn't matter. If you're a twin, you are invited to this party. And the scientists, biologists, and psychologists, they descend upon this place to talk to all these twins because the twins have found each other if they've been separated, and those are the ones we really want to look at because we can see the differences between them and see how much the genetics is changed by environment. And height and weight are one of those things that do change. But interestingly, if one of the twins becomes a fireman, the other one could either be a fireman or a policeman. That's interesting that their interests stay very similar. So there's a part of our mind that controls our interests, and that seems to be very strong, and environmental influences don't seem to affect it as much. So we have a lot of intelligence questions that we give them, intelligence tests and personality tests, and to find out the differences. So similarities are attributed to genetics, and differences are attributed to the environment. And we'll talk about some of the similarities and differences, especially in the next chapter, the developmental chapter, but throughout this class we'll be talking about that. This particular section is about our nature, and that is our nervous system, but also our endocrine system, the molecules that change us and control us. And we will talk about both of them in this unit. The first one, the majority of it, we'll be talking about the nervous system, and then we'll talk about the endocrine system at the end. The nerve communication is in one direction. That means that the information comes into a nerve at what we call the dendrites. We'll see pictures of this in just a minute. And then flows through the nerve and out through the axon. It's a single cell. A nerve is a single cell. A neuron is a single cell. I'll tell you the difference between nerve and neuron in just a minute. But a neuron is a single cell, and it only has one direction that it can send information, which means even the most primitive creature on Earth, amoebas, have to have at least two nerves, one to allow them to move and one to sense the world around them. One pulls in information, the other one sends out information to the body of the organism to move. So we have at least two. Of course, in the human body, we have 86 billion just in the brain. Just in the brain, we have 86 billion when we're born. So the brain, the human brain at birth, if a normal child has 86 billion neurons in it, it will not increase the number of neurons. And yet the brain will continue to grow and become heavier throughout 13 years. So why is it that the brain doesn't have new neurons being developed, but still gets heavier? And it is the connections between those 86 billion neurons that makes the brain heavier. They start out with 86 billion, but not all of them are connected together. And then the connections start occurring and starts growing and building connections in the brain based on the environment, what happens to that child during the first 4 years, really big, but the first 13 years. At the end of 13 years, you're normally size and the weight that it's going to be for the rest of your life. But you still are growing, you're still building neurons. It turns out that we not only build new neurons, but we prune neurons that aren't being used. Just like you prune a tree, cutting off limbs that aren't any good anymore, the brain prunes itself and kills off neurons that aren't being used anymore. One of the reasons why it's really important to have as many of those connections as possible before you're 12 years old, 13 years old, so that as it prunes, you have connections made by all the others that are left over. And that is environmental. How many connections you have is environmental. And poor people, people with low incomes in poverty neighborhoods and poverty themselves, don't have as much stimulation and don't have as much nutrition and don't have as many connections as those people who are that same person in a middle-class family would have many more connections. And so poverty itself is bad for the brain. You do have some small amount of nerves that are built and created by the hippocampus. The hippocampus is implicated in memory. And approximately 700 new neurons are created every day from the hippocampus. 700 possible, new memories? So if you take 700, multiply it by 365, because there's 700 every day, and multiply it by 83, which is the typical normal age of a person at this point in life is 83. That's normal. There are still people who are living to about 120 is the maximum, I think, that we've ever seen. There's a person right now on Earth that's 116 years old. Most of the oldest are in Asia, and in the United States, very rarely over 100. But there are people who can live over 100, and supposedly there's what people are saying right now, biologists, somebody born today, in this generation coming up, has already been born that will live to be 150 because of our abilities to control our environment and control our nutrition and control our exercise and control the germs that we have that kill us as well. So supposedly somebody is already born that will live to be 150 if the Earth is around still by then. So that multiplication, 83 times 365 times 700, comes out to be 21 million. 21 million new neurons in your entire lifetime after you're born. That is insignificant compared to the 86 billion that we have in our brain to begin with. But it might be the 21 million things that you know. And memory, as we'll talk about when we get to the memory chapter, the memories you have never disappear. The pathway to the memory disappears. And we know this through brain surgery. During a brain surgery, the patient can be awake because there's no pain fibers in the brain. And so during the brain surgery, we can stimulate parts of the brain with a little pen with a little electrode on the end of it to stimulate that particular area of the brain. And we know because of that you can move your finger, you can put the electrode on a particular part of the motor cortex and the finger moves, another finger for the other one, a whole hand moves, your feet move. So we can map the entire brain, and we'll talk about that in this section. But sometimes we touch a part of the brain and it's not part of the motor cortex or the sensation cortex. Instead, it's a part of the memory system of the brain, and a person that's in their 70s will remember a cat or a dog, a pet, family pet they had when they were 4 years old. The memory is still there. It just has no active way of getting to it. And when we touch it with an electrode, it recreates the connections. Oh, I remember everything about that particular animal because you've stimulated that particular part of the memory system. So that could be 21 million new neurons. Might be 21 million things that you might be able to remember. So neurons in the central nervous system are slightly different than nerves in the peripheral system. Now, I use neuron and nerve interchangeably. I don't really make a distinction, but if you're in biology, if you're taking physiology right now, your class is pretty much mirroring what we're talking about right now in that physiology class. And you will be taught the difference between a neuron, which is a single neuron, a single cell, and a nerve, which is a bundle of axons from many different neurons. And so there's a very big difference between a neuron and a nerve. In this class, you don't have to know the difference between them, but in biology, you're going to have to know the difference between them. And the difference is that a neuron, we're talking about one cell. A nerve, we're talking about multiple cells. And the nerves are in the peripheral system, not the central system. The central nervous system is neurons. The peripheral nervous system is nerves. I cut my finger once really badly, and I lost all sensation in the tip of my finger. I couldn't feel. It was like there was a piece of plastic wrapping my finger, and I was touching. I couldn't feel pressure. I couldn't feel touch. It was like it was not there. It was very disturbing. But over time, the nerve healed. Peripheral nerves heal. Central nervous system neurons do not. If you damage a neuron, it is damaged forever. And so we have to be very careful of our brain. You need to wear a helmet when you're out riding a bicycle or riding a motorcycle. You can skin up your knees and your arms and break bones, but if you and they can be fixed. If you damage your brain cells, they cannot be fixed. And we're finding this out now in football players, traumatic brain injury, where they have been hit in the head so many times that their brain function has deteriorated because their brain neurons have been damaged. If you fall down and hit your head, usually you see a lot of spots, right? And in cartoons, they have like little birds flying around or stars rolling around. It's not, right, birds or stars, but you do. You see spots because you've hit the back of your head, which is the occipital lobe, which is where your sight comes from, the back of your head. But usually you don't damage it so badly. It's just that it took a blow, and so there's electrical signals being sent off, and those electrical signals in the brain mean to you, to the brain, you've seen something. So it creates all these lights floating around. And there's actually an issue called Hppd where people see these visions of things all around them. I have what's called occipital migraines, and it's caused by stress. When I was vice president of a corporation, it was a very stressful job. I loved it, but it was a very stressful job. And one day I lost all sight in my right eye. I could not see anything out of my right eye. It wasn't black. It was like looking through a kaleidoscope. I don't know if you all have ever seen a kaleidoscope. You look through this thing and it changes patterns, and colors are all changing all the time as you spin the kaleidoscope. That was what I was seeing, and it scared the heck out of me. And I went to the doctor, and they said, oh, well, it's called an occipital migraine. It doesn't have any pain associated with it, but you lose vision in one eye, and it will return eventually as your stress level reduces and you relax. It'll come back, and it did. It took a couple of hours for it to come back, and once I knew that it wasn't dangerous, I sat and I was watching. It was like, wow, it's really fun. All these beautiful shapes and patterns and colors. It was kind of cool. But it was also very frustrating when it got in the way of me seeing. And it's just your brain in stress. And the doctor said, you're very stressed out. You need to find the stress and remove it, get rid of it. And I knew it was work. So I finally just quit work. And my wife will tell you, if you ever ask her, I stayed home for 6 months playing spider solitaire in my pajamas, just relaxing, trying to get this occipital migraines to stop. And eventually they did. They went away. But during that whole time, I also taught online as an adjunct in psychology for COA, and then they opened up a spot full-time, And that's how I became a psychologist teacher right here at COA, is because of those occipital migraines in the job that I had. I was making $60,000 a year and headed for, you know, a 3-digit income, and I stopped it because it wasn't worth it. And I hope that you all realize one day, money is not the be-all and end-all. Your family is way more important. Your health is way more important than money. Yes, we need enough to survive. And I went to work, I went from $60,000 to $27,000. But we didn't really miss the income because it was extra. Right? We still could go out to eat. We still could pay our bills. So that's an occipital migraine. And that's a neuron problem. If I had damaged them permanently, I would see this occipital migraine for the rest of my life. But it wasn't a damage. It was just these neurons being wired and fired off in strange ways, sort of like epilepsy. And a lot of people say our brains, we only use like 10% of our brain. So the rest of the brain is like 90%. What does it do? What does it do? Maybe it does parapsychology stuff, like where you can read minds and move objects and stuff. And it is true we only use 10% of our brain, but we use our entire brain, 100% of our brain, but only 10% at a time. And people who use 100% at a time are called epileptics. If your brain is going off all the time, you're in an epileptic seizure, a full grand mal seizure. So we don't want to have 100% of our brain working all at the same time. But our whole brain works. There isn't a hidden portion of the brain that doesn't have electrical signals in it at times. So that's neurons and nerves, right? And I tend to use either nerve or neuron when I'm talking, and I don't mean to make a distinction between them. But you have to know it if you're in biology. The central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is all the rest of our nerves and in our body. They connect the central nervous system to our senses. The peripheral nervous system senses our touch and the other organs in our body. So the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system use nerves and neurons, and I've made you aware of the distinction between the two, hopefully, so that you have an idea of what they are. But our brain has other types of cells in it besides neurons. It has a type of cell called a glial cell. And glial cells wrap themselves around certain neurons on the axon of the neuron, which we'll talk about in a minute, and actually help the health of that neuron. The glial cells help the neuron to function, and it also, any neuron that has glial cells connected to it is a faster neuron than cells that don't. Cells that have glial cells attached to them are white matter because the glial cells are basically fatty, and so they look white. And the ones that don't have the glial cells connected to them are gray. So we have gray matter in our brain, and we have white matter in our brain. The central nervous system job is to integrate and coordinate all the bodily functions, processing all our incoming neural messages and sending out commands to the body. As I'm talking to you, my brain is telling my mouth, my tongue, my breathing to be a specific way. I'm completely unaware of that, and I don't even think about what it is that I'm about to tell you. It's just sort of a stream of consciousness that comes out of my mouth as I'm talking to you. I'm not really aware of what I want to say before I say it. The spinal cord coordinates the activities of the left and the right sides of the body, but remember this, the right side of the head, the brain, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. And why they cross like that, I have no idea. Evolutionary psychologists would say for some reason it was adaptable. Those people who had that lived better, produced better than those who had it just straight down the body. So for some reason we have this connection between the left side of the body and the right side of the brain, and the right side of the body, left side of the brain. If you have a left brain stroke, the right side of your body becomes useless. If you have a right brain stroke, the left side of your body becomes useless. So the spinal cord is also responsible for something called a fast action reflex, or a spinal reflex. Means that, let's say I'm talking to somebody through the car window. They're about to leave from a party that I've had, and I'm saying goodbye and hoping that they'll come back again sometime and that we had a good time. So we're just talking, but they have the car in neutral, and my foot is under the wheel, and they take their foot off the brake, and the car starts to move backwards. I will move my foot away from the car before my brain knows why I'm doing it, because the foot has a sense neuron that goes up to the spinal cord that connects directly to a motor neuron that goes right back down to the leg. So it's called a spinal reflex. It goes up, the motor cortex goes down and moves the leg as it continues up to the brain to tell us why we're moving our leg. So we really move our leg before we actually know why. Now it's a split second. There's a tiny second, fraction of a second that it happens. So we think we know why we moved our foot, but if we had to think about it, there's pressure on my foot. I'll bet the tire is moving backwards and it's going to roll over my foot. I better move it. It's too late by then. Our foot's crushed. So the spinal reflex is an unlearned response controlled by one efferent motor neuron and one afferent sensory neuron. And if you click that link, check out the site, it'll tell you more about that. The spinal reflex allows us to move when we're in danger before the brain knows what the danger is. The peripheral nervous system is so complicated that it's broken into two parts, the somatic and the autonomic divisions. The somatic, soma in Latin means body. So the somatic area of the peripheral nervous system controls our skeletal muscles, controls all of our movements, all of the jaw movements of our lips and tongues when we're talking. All of that is the somatic system. The autonomic system actually sounds like automatic, autonomic, and it is the automatic sections of our body. So we don't think about our heart rate unless we have a heart attack. We don't have to think about making our heart go. It just goes. We don't think about our breath. We don't think about breathing. We just breathe. And if we fall down and get the wind knocked, has anybody ever had their wind knocked out of them? Does anybody have? Yes, some people have. And for those who haven't had the wind knocked out of them, it is a scary, when you fall down, hit your back, all your lungs, just everything's blown out of you. That's the wind knocked out of you. And then you know you have to breathe in, but you can't. Something has been stopped, so you can't breathe in. Now, it's a few seconds, but it feels like I'm about to die because I can't breathe, and I need to breathe because all the wind's been knocked out of me. That, if you have had that happen to you, you know what it means to think about breathing. And of course, if you have asthma or some other issue, like I have the CPAP machines because I have a breathing issue, which we will talk about in another section. I think about breathing at night all the time. So the autonomic nervous system regulates your heart, respiration, digestion. The somatic system regulates the actions of our skeletal muscles and contains the sensory nerves as well. The peripheral nervous system, somatic sensory nerves, all the senses that we have. The autonomic system is also so complex that it's broken down into two parts as well. It is the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. The sympathetic system gets us ready for fighting, and the parasympathetic system gets all of our energy built up for that fight. So the sympathetic system deals with emergency responses and mobilizes the energy reserves. It increases your heart and your lung activity and inhibits most everything else getting you ready to fight, flight, or freeze is what happens in a scary situation. When some loud bang goes off, you end up in an automatic response, an action reflex that is built into us as human beings, where we will either turn to fight, run, or freeze. Fight, flight, or freeze syndrome is called. And the sympathetic nervous system is part of that process. And the sympathetic nervous system uses our fat stores. Our fat stores are energy stores. We use up our fat to create energy. Some of us have way more fat than, like myself, than we need for the energy that we might need in the future. But that's what the fat stores are. They're an energy store. The body can use that fat to create energy. So the sympathetic system uses that fat. The parasympathetic system, I obviously have an overactive parasympathetic system because I'm a little big in the tummy area. So the parasympathetic system monitors the routine operations of our body, and it conserves and restores our energy when we're out of the emergency situation. So it decreases the heart rate, it decreases lung activity, and it stimulates most of everything else. You can remember the sympathetic system will increase heart and lung activity and inhibit most everything else because it also inhibits the sphincter muscle, and that is why we are sympathetic to people who are in an accident because they have to change their underwear. That's how you can remember sympathetic, right? It increases lung activity, increases heart activity, inhibits most of everything else, and the parasympathetic system does the opposite. This is a picture for those of you who are picture-oriented. You can see this in your head when you're taking your tests or your quizzes. The nervous system is broken down into two parts, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is broken down into the autonomic and the somatic systems, and the autonomic is broken down into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Are there any questions about these? Okay. Are some of you taking the physiology classes at this point, at this time? Is this kind of mirroring what you're learning in physiology right now? Nobody's taking physiology. It's a good course. Let's talk about the nervous system a little more, the sensory and the motor cortexes and motor neurons and the interneurons. So a neuron, as I said, is a cell, a single cell in the body specialized for receiving and transmitting information. The sensory neurons, also called afferent neurons, carry messages from the sensory receptors toward the central nervous system. So they bring in information into the system. Then the motor neurons are called efferent neurons. They carry messages away from the central nervous system toward the muscles and the glands. But there's not a neuron that goes from your head, through your spinal cord, down through your hip, through your legs, down to your toe. There are neurons in between. So the neuron from the head sends messages to the next neuron, which sends next to the next one, and finally your toe, where you curl your toe. So those are called interneurons. They carry messages between nerve cells. They might connect to another nerve, or they might connect to some organ or muscle in the system. And this is a picture of a nerve or neuron that connects to a muscle. So I have up in the top, this is an interneuron because it's actually getting messages from another neuron. So this is, if you can picture, it goes off into the distance. This is the end of another neuron, and it is connecting to this particular neuron's dendrites. Dendrites are the area that receive information for a neuron. So the information gets its information at the dendrite. It goes through the dendrite into the soma or body of the cell, and then comes out the information in an electrical charge through what's called the axon, and ends in the axon in what is called terminal, it's an ending, terminal buttons. So the terminal buttons are either sending information to another neuron, this would be terminal buttons up here, that are sending information to the dendrites of this neuron. These are terminal buttons of this particular neuron connected to a muscle, but they don't touch. There is something called the synaptic cleft. It is a space in between the terminal buttons and the next object, whatever it is, either an organ or a muscle or another neurons, dendrites. There's a space between them. Every one of you should know that you need a connection for electricity to flow. You can touch the plastic and you don't get shocked, but if you stick a bobby pin in there, you're going to get blown across the room. My sister actually did that. She stuck a bobby pin in the hole and she bounced across the room because of the electricity going in through her hand. And she burned that hand where she was holding the bobby pin. But what's interesting is about an hour later, the other hand developed a burn on it too. Very interesting how our body works. So we know that you have to have a connection for electricity to work. So how does the information, the electrical flow from the terminal button on one get to the dendrite on the other? And it's not a spark, because we know there's sparks, right? We get sparks when we touch things, and that we have too much electricity in our bodies, and we touch something electrical and get a spark because of it, a shock. Right? But if there was enough electricity to cause a spark to jump that gap, it would kill the cell. So it's not because there's a lot of electricity building up in that cell. It isn't electricity that transfers back and forth between the two cells. It's chemicals. So we have the synaptic cleft, the terminal buttons, the dendrites, the soma, and the axon, and then the terminal buttons. But there's more to it than that. And in the next picture you'll see there's what look like, if you can see this, they look like hot dogs being lined up in a row. Do you see that? Looks like a hot dog and a roll with the hot dog end and another roll with the hot dog in it and another roll with the hot dog in it. Do you see that? Okay, I'm getting some yeses. That's the glial cells connected to the axon. As I said, some axons are myelinated. That's called myelination, where the glial cells hang on to them, and they look white. And there are some neurons that do not have them, and they look gray. The ones that have the glial cells attached are faster. They're more healthy, and the discharges from the use of the cell are removed by the glial cells. Glial cells are very useful to certain neurons, but not every neuron has one. The frontal lobes of our brain are myelinated neurons. The frontal lobes of our brain control our emotions, and the frontal lobes of the brain control our judgments. It is the last part of the brain, around the age of 21, that gets myelinated. So our brain is getting, the neurons aren't just, they're not born with the myelination on them. The glial cells move up into the brain and they make their connections in specific ways to the particular neuron that they're supposed to make the connection to. The glial cells in the frontal lobe do not fully develop and connect with their neurons until about the age of 18 to 21, which is why 18 to 21 is considered an adult. Before that, you're not considered an adult because you cannot make proper judgments, and your emotion center is not, the limbic system, is not being controlled well by the frontal lobes because they're not myelinated yet. You're not thinking fast enough, and you're not healthy enough in the frontal lobes to control your emotions. That's why teenagers make strange and bad decisions sometimes, because they don't make the good judgments. Their frontal lobes aren't made connected well yet, and they are so emotional because they have hormones flowing through their system, but the frontal lobe, which controls their emotions, is not really online yet. And that's, now some remember, some people myelinate faster than others. When we get to the intelligence chapter, we'll find out Michael Kearney, who graduated from elementary school at, I believe, was the age of six. When people are normally going in, he graduated from elementary school at 6 years of age. So, and his brain was fully myelinated way early. So there's a spectrum, just like there's a spectrum of your personalities, a spectrum of intelligence, a spectrum of sexuality. There's a spectrum of how we develop. Some people develop much faster, some people slower. So this little space where you see the hot dog between the myelination is called the node of Ranvier, because a scientist named Ranvier, he discovered them, so it's named after him, the nodes of Ranvier. And this doesn't show much of anything else except one part. See the axon? We start off with our dendrites communications. It flows through, always in the same direction, from the dendrites through the soma, the body of the cell, to the axon. But the axon can bifurcate. It can become two axons out of that one, and the amount of energy that's produced in both of them is equal. It doesn't have the amount of electrical power going through them. It is the same amount of electrical power. And it is, we have two, or bifurcate, trifurcate, quadricate. It can break up into lots and lots of connections to connect to other cells and send its information to another cell. And there is a process in biology called, when neurons fire together, they wire together. So you have two neurons that are firing off always at the same time, then those two are going to make a connection to each other because they seem to be connected in some way. And so those two will wire together, and then if one fires off for a different reason, this one's going to fire off anyway because they're connected to each other. And that's the reason why the brain continues to grow from the age of about 11, which is where you have the majority of your brain has already developed. It's at the weight that it's supposed to be at 11 to 13 years of age. But it continues to grow and make these connections. At the same time, it's pruning other parts of the brain. In other words, cutting off and killing off its neurons that it's not using, which is why you need as much information as possible, especially in the first 4 years of life, where your brain makes all the connections between neurons so that as it's cutting off other neurons, that doesn't matter because there are connections to other neurons that are still alive. So the brain continues to grow even after the age of 13, but never grows much more in weight. It's hit its full weight at that point. And I always show the dendrites up and the axons down. There are 8 different configurations. Neurons do not just always look up. They're looking to the side, they're looking diagonal, they're all over the brain. They're not all centered straight up. Okay? I want you to be sure you understand that. I have to draw it in a specific way, but I always draw it for the dendrites up and the axon down. That is not necessarily the case. Axons and dendrites can go all over the brain in about 8 ways. So this is just what I've already talked to you about. This is just the dendrites, the nucleus, the soma, the axon. I've already given you all the definitions of these. The myelinated cells. And here's an interesting part of the myelination process, or the glial cells. They protect the brain. They protect the neuron that they're connected to. They provide nutrients to the neuron they're connected to, and they remove the waste products that are built up in the axon from its use. But when these glial cells, for some reason, start dying, and there are diseases where they start dying, one of those is called multiple sclerosis. That is what multiple sclerosis is, the loss of the glial cells, and then the death of that neuron because it no longer can function without the glial cells. Now, there's another disease that everybody's heard about that is part and parcel to the glial cells. There are proteins that are built up in the brain, and sometimes those proteins run amok and just start growing and growing and growing. There's lots and lots and lots of them, more than you should have. And those proteins, called plaque, get in between the neuron and the glial cell and push the glial cell off of the neuron. And that is part of the process that causes what we call Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease, the brain produces an overabundance of protein called plaque, and it gets in the way of the glial cells working with the neurons. And that causes Alzheimer's. Also, the nodes of Ranvier, I talked about the terminal buttons. So I said if they can't connect the two nerves, they don't touch each other, the neurons, the terminal buttons do not touch on the other side dendrite. How does the electrical signal get across? And that is chemicals. When the terminal buttons get an electrical charge, they throw up and spit out chemicals called neurotransmitters that end up crossing the space and connecting to the dendrite. And if enough of them connect to the dendrite fires off. And that's how the communication occurs. So we are both electrical and chemical in nature. And if something happens to the electrical system, we have problems. And if something happens to the chemical system, we have problems. And that's what drug companies do, is try to figure out what the problems are and then repair the problem with a synthetic drug rather than the neurotransmitters that are used. Sometimes there's too many neurotransmitters. Sometimes there's too few neurotransmitters. Sometimes the neurotransmitters sit in the cleft for too long, in the space for too long. They don't get sucked back up into the terminal buttons or destroyed in some way. So there's all kinds of reasons and ways that drugs can help us when we have issues that are caused by the neurons not communicating properly. The neural impulse is just that electrical charge that goes from the dendrites all the way down to the terminal buttons. And I said down again, it doesn't have to be down, it can be sideways. It goes through the axon to the terminal buttons. And it's a very, very minimal charge. It's the normal neuron sits at a steady state of negative 70 millivolts. Very tiny charge, negative 70 millivolts. And then it fires off and it only goes up to plus 30 millivolts, but it's a 100 millivolt change that occurs as the neuron is firing off electrically. And the way that it does this is to move elements, chemical elements, ions, from inside of itself to outside of itself and then suck them back in again. And that's the charge. That's the actual movement of ions back and forth that causes the electrical charge until it hits the terminal buttons, and then they spit out the neurotransmitters. The elements, chemical elements that are used in a neuron to cause this electrical charge is Na, K, and Cl. How many of you know what Na, K, and Cl are? Just name one of them. Let's see if I can get all three of them with the 20 of you that are in here. Sodium is Na. That's correct. I got sodium. What is K? Potassium is K. Yes, I got Catherine and who was that? Anna. Both got potassium, and Anna also got chlorine. Yes, chloride. It's an ion, so it's chloride. So Na, K, and Cl are sodium, potassium, and chloride. What happens when you put Na and Cl together? Sodium chloride. What is that? Every single one of you uses it every single day. Salt. Lauren is correct. Salt. Na, K, Na and Cl is sodium chloride. It is table salt. But some people have high blood pressure and they can't have sodium. So they can't use salt because sodium chloride causes their high blood pressure to go up even more. And you don't want strokes caused by high blood pressure or other problems caused by high blood pressure. So we have KCl, potassium chloride. Potassium chloride is a salt substitute, and you can find it in the store under the name Mrs. Dash. Have any of you ever used a Mrs. Dash or seen it in the store? Some of the younger students probably not, but some of the older students who shop and cook may actually have used Mrs. Dash. It comes in multiple flavors, but basically it's the same as salt except that it uses potassium instead of sodium. I had a problem once where when I would wake up and stand up out of bed, I would pass out. I would fall on the floor, pass out. So I went to the doctor, and the doctor did all kinds of tests to try to figure out what was wrong, and it turned out I didn't have enough sodium in my system. I drank too much water and didn't replace it with my food, with salting my food. So he said, I don't believe I'm going to tell you this, but you need to eat more salt. So instead, of course, there's Gatorade. Gatorade has all three of these in it so that you can replace your electrolytes. It's called electrolytes when you're sweating a lot because you're working out. And that's really what it's for. You should not be drinking Gatorade if you are not working out because it has a heck of a lot of sugar in it, and sugar is bad for you unless you're using it up right away as you're exercising. So instead, what I do is I use a product called Smart Water, and you may have seen this in the stores. Also, it's Food Lions and Farm Fresh sell it. It's called Smart Water, and it's just water with sodium, potassium, and chloride in it, the electrolytes that you need for your brain, and it doesn't have any taste at all. It's just water, and so I drink that instead of Gatorade or something else that has a sweetener in it, or even the sugar substitutes are almost as bad for you as sugar is. Sugar has fructose in it. Fructose and sucrose. Fructose and sucrose make sugar. Fructose is bad, really bad for you. You should not have fructose, and if anything has just fructose in it, if it says in the ingredients fructose, don't eat it, don't drink it, stay away from it. They also call it high fructose corn syrup, HFCS, it's also called. Not good for you. But that's a whole nother nutrition substance study, so we won't talk about that. The neurotransmitters are the chemicals that continue the neural impulse, and the resting impulse, I told you, is negative 70 millivolts. It goes from negative 70 to 30 millivolts, but it can only fire off 1,000 times per second. I know that's a lot, 1,000 times per second, but that is the limit of a nerve. A nerve cannot fire off more than 1,000 times per second. Now, I can snap my fingers really fast, but I can't make it 1,000 times per second because of the mechanics of how you snap your fingers and getting it back again. So if I could snap my fingers at 1,000 per second, I'd probably set my fingers on fire from the friction. But you need a certain amount of time for the cell to go from positive 30 back to negative 70 millivolts again. That's called the refractory period. It's a relaxation period for the nerve as a neuron as it goes back to its resting potential and accumulate just the negative 70 millivolts. Push out the positives, take in the negatives. And then it'll fire off again. But that's a problem thinking about it. It can only fire off 1,000 times per second. So how is it that we hear at 20,000 hertz? Because we can hear from 20 to 20,000 hertz. 20,000 times per second, a sound coming into our ear, and we can distinguish it from a 19,000 hertz. But our neurons in our ear can only fire off 1,000 times per second. So why is it that we can hear above 1,000 hertz? Because we shouldn't be able to. When we get the sensation and perception, we'll talk about why that happens and how the neurons in the ears have been established so that we can hear above 1,000 hertz. That's the end of this particular lecture. If you haven't said you're here, because some of you came in late, this is the way I'm doing the roll from now on. In the chat box, put your name and say here, and then I can save the chat box for the day, and I have then who's here. So if you didn't say who's here already, that you're here already, make sure you put in that you're here. And if you're from one of the other class, if you're from the other class sitting in today's lecture from the 8 o'clock section, and you couldn't make it to the 8 o'clock, make sure that you say that you're from the 8 o'clock section. All right. That's it. Stay healthy. I will see you on Thursday. Bye. I'll be here for those who want to talk, have questions. That's it. The class is over. It's time to call it a day. Yay. Turn my phone off, log out on my phone, leave the meeting from my phone, and then log out, stop the share, and end the meeting. Nope, not yet. I have to save the chat. Thank you. Chat is now saved. Where is that? Right here? Nope, not there. Come here, where are you? All right. Escape from this. 29, discard. $29. Today is September 1st. Okay. All right, close that. And this one, reduce it. This one. There we go, showing folder.